Marcus Bennett was the kind of man you noticed immediately, not just for his calm demeanor, but for the quiet strength that radiated from every gesture, every look. At 38 years old, a former Navy SEAL, Marcus was more than just a soldier who had faced danger head-on in war zones. He was a husband, a father, and a man longing for peace after years of chaos. On an early autumn morning in Seattle, as the first rays of sunlight gently filtered through the tree branches, Marcus walked through Washington Heights, the neighborhood he had chosen to call home. Familiar streets, friendly neighbors, the soft chirping of birds, and the light breeze created a serene scene, a perfect setting for the beginning of his day. But Marcus knew that peace was fragile. Deep within him lingered memories of harsh battles and the ever-present shadow of death. Those memories didn't fade, they shaped him, but he fought to leave that darkness behind and live a normal life amid the complexities of society. So the first weeks in Washington Heights were days filled with quiet contentment, moments of normalcy he had longed for. Washington Heights, with its tree-lined streets and historic homes, represented more than a residence. It symbolized a community in slow transition. Though predominantly white, Marcus often felt welcomed, even if sometimes met with curious or cautious glances. He understood that beneath the surface, biases and unspoken prejudices existed, yet he chose to believe in respect and harmony as achievable goals. Every step Marcus took along those sidewalks carried the story of resilience and pride. He was not only a veteran, but a living symbol of overcoming adversity. His story wasn't just personal. It echoed the voices of countless others fighting for fairness and recognition. That morning, Marcus paused outside a small coffee shop, a local favorite, where he often enjoyed a hot cup and exchanged friendly words with the owner. These daily exchanges and smiles knitted a fabric of community Marcus cherished. Still beneath his calm, he remained vigilant, prepared for whatever challenges might arise. Behind that serene exterior was a man who had faced injustice, but refused to let it diminish his belief in right and wrong. Marcus held fast to the idea that no matter the obstacles, persistence and integrity would lead to justice and change. Yet no one could have foreseen that such an ordinary moment would mark the beginning of a chain of events that would shake Marcus, his community, and the local police system. One fateful afternoon, as Marcus walked through his neighborhood, the tranquility was shattered by the sudden arrival of a large police presence, officers whose attitudes and actions would soon ignite a storm. They stopped Marcus without clear cause. What was supposed to be a simple check quickly turned into an overwhelming display of power. Cold handcuffs snapped around his wrists, and Marcus felt the crushing weight of helplessness as he was thrust into a situation he could neither control nor resist. This wasn't just about one man, it was a stark illustration of the struggle between the individual and a fractured system. Word of the incident spread rapidly, transforming Marcus's story into a rallying cry for those silenced by injustice and misjudged because of their skin color. In that moment, Marcus became more than a lone soldier. He became the face of a larger fight, a fight for justice, dignity, and human rights. This story is not just a personal tragedy, it's a powerful reminder of the realities still embedded in our society. It awakens our conscience, urges those who seek change to act, and inspires those who believe that no matter how hard the fight, justice will prevail when people stand strong and speak out for what is right. Marcus Bennett, the soldier, leads us on this journey. Through his challenges and perseverance, we witness the hope and possibility of change. Join me now as we step into Marcus's world to understand more deeply the moments that shaped him, the trials he endured, and above all, the indomitable strength of resilience. Before we get started, drop a comment below telling us where you're tuning in from and what time it is. We'd love to see how far this story has traveled and who it's touching along the way. All right, let's jump right into the story. Sergeant Kyle Rogers stood as a symbol of authority in his precinct, a man whose badge and uniform commanded respect, or so it seemed on the surface. At 35 years old, Kyle had spent over a decade in law enforcement, rising through the ranks, with a reputation that was at best controversial within the department. Behind his stern gaze and commanding presence, however, lurked a history that few dared to confront. Within the internal affairs records, Kyle's file was marked by 6 separate complaints. Complaints that all carried a similar theme: allegations of racial bias, excessive use of force, and aggressive conduct during arrests. Yet remarkably, none of these complaints led to any meaningful disciplinary action. Instead, Kyle's trajectory continued upwards, shielded by a system that often chose to look away or justify his actions as part of the job. What drove Kyle Rogers to behave with such impunity? To understand, one must delve deeper into the psychology of a man shaped by his environment, one where the line between protection and oppression blurred dangerously. The law enforcement culture he grew up in was steeped in a tough, sometimes ruthless mentality that prized control and dominance over dialogue and empathy. Kyle came from a background where policing was more about asserting power than serving communities, especially the communities of color. His early years on the force were marked by mentorship from senior officers who viewed strict control as the only way to maintain order. They taught him implicitly and explicitly that bending rules was acceptable if it meant getting the job done. Over time, this ethos hardened into a personal conviction. Kyle started to see those he policed not as citizens but as threats. His interactions with Black residents in particular were often marked by suspicion and hostility long before any words were exchanged. A casual glance or a misunderstood gesture could trigger his temper, a temper that often turned physical. Behind the badge, Kyle was a man struggling with internal conflicts. His sense of justice was entangled with prejudice, and his authority felt like a weapon rather than a tool for protection. Yet the department's failure to hold him accountable only reinforced his belief that he was untouchable. This protective shield wasn't just about ignoring complaints, it was an active culture of silence and complicity. Officers who witnessed Kyle's behavior hesitated to report or confront him, fearing retaliation or ostracism. The Internal Affairs Unit was often understaffed and underfunded, more focused on protecting the department's image than pursuing genuine reform. The system that should have been a safeguard instead became a breeding ground for abuse. Complaints were routinely dismissed or buried in paperwork. Witnesses found themselves pressured into silence. And officers like Kyle operated with a dangerous combination of arrogance and impunity. This systemic failure extended beyond just Kyle. It reflected a broader crisis within policing nationwide, a culture resistant to change, where accountability is often sacrificed on the altar of institutional loyalty. Stories like Kyle's are not isolated incidents. They are symptoms of a deeply flawed system that too often protects the perpetrators rather than the victims. The consequences of this culture were devastating. For the communities Kyle patrolled, his presence was a reminder of fear rather than safety. For Marcus and Bennett, the Navy SEAL who encountered Kyle that fateful day, it was the beginning of a night that would challenge not only his own resilience, but the very fabric of justice in the city. As we explore this story, it is crucial to understand the human factors behind the badge. Sergeant Kyle Rogers is not just a villain, he is a product of a system that enables and encourages such behavior. Unpacking this complex reality is key to comprehending the magnitude of what happened and why real change remains so elusive. This is the story of a man who wore authority as armor, but wielded it as a weapon in the system that failed to restrain him. It's a sobering look into how power, prejudice, and protectionism collide within law enforcement with lives hanging in the balance. Washington Heights was a neighborhood where the quiet hum of everyday life barely masked the tension simmering just beneath the surface. Nestled on the outskirts of a mid-sized American city, this community was predominantly white. Over 80% of its residents identified as such, and the presence of people of color was sparse and often unwelcome. The streets were lined with well-kept houses, small businesses, and narrow sidewalks, where neighbors exchanged pleasantries, yet many interactions were tinged with an unspoken wariness. This was a neighborhood with a history, a complex tapestry, woven with moments of solidarity, but also shadows of racial mistrust. Stories of past incidents had become part of the collective memory, whispered warnings passed down through years. In recent decades, Washington Heights had seen its share of conflicts sparked by racial prejudice, from heated disputes at local bars to police stops that escalated with alarming frequency. Among the residents, there was a palpable divide. White families often spoke of preserving the character of their neighborhoods, sometimes using that phrase as a veil for exclusionary attitudes. People of color who lived or worked here shared stories of feeling scrutinized, of being followed in stores, or of police officers who seemed quicker to suspect them of wrongdoing than their white counterparts. A local convenience store owner, a middle-aged black man named Jerome, recalled times when officers had stopped him repeatedly without cause, inspecting his ID with suspicion and questioning his presence in the area. On the other side, some white residents expressed unease about demographic changes elsewhere in the city, fearful of the unknown and clinging to the status quo. These anxieties often fed into biases, whether overt or subconscious, coloring how they viewed their neighbors of different races. The local police force, like many around the country, was not immune to these societal undercurrents. Washington Heights Precinct had long struggled with a reputation for heavy-handed policing. Complaints of racial profiling were frequent, but investigations often stalled or concluded with minimal consequences. Officers, many of whom grew up in or around the neighborhood, carried their own biases shaped by upbringing, peer influences, and departmental culture. One officer in particular, Sergeant Kyle Rogers, epitomized the complexities of policing this divided community. He was known to patrol aggressively, especially in areas with higher concentrations of residents of color. His approach was characterized by a belief that strict control was necessary to maintain order, but it often crossed the line into intimidation and abuse. The night Marcus Bennett returned home from a routine visit to a local gym was the night these simmering tensions erupted into a confrontation that would send shockwaves throughout Washington Heights and beyond. Marcus, a 33-year-old former Navy SEAL, had recently settled in the neighborhood with his wife and two children, hoping for a fresh start after years of service. Standing tall and composed, Marcus was respected not just for his military record, but for his calm demeanor and commitment to community service. Yet that evening, as he walked down the familiar streets, his very presence would be met with suspicion. Sergeant Kyle Rogers spotted Marcus near a small park, his posture alert and eyes scanning the surroundings. To Kyle, Marcus seemed out of place, not because of anything Marcus had done, but because of who he was, a black man in a predominantly white neighborhood, dressed casually, walking with a quiet confidence that unsettled the officer. What followed was a chilling demonstration of how perception and prejudice could escalate into confrontation. Kyle called for backup, assembling a team that descended on Marcus with a show of force disproportionate to any actual threat. The streets filled with flashing lights, the sounds of radios crackling, and the commanding voices ordering Marcus to halt. This moment was more than just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a neighborhood divided, a police culture grappling with its own biases, and a man caught in the crosshairs of systemic injustice. Stories like this were not new to Washington Heights. Years before, a young black man named David had been stopped and handcuffed in similar circumstances, sparking protests that faded without resolution. More recently, a black woman who ran a local daycare had faced harassment from officers during traffic stops, leaving her fearful and isolated. These stories, repeated over time, painted a picture of a community struggling to reconcile its past with its present. The encounter between Marcus Bennett and Sergeant Kyle Rogers was about to add a new chapter one that would challenge the status quo and ignite conversations about race, authority, and justice. As we delve deeper into this story, it's essential to understand the setting, not just the physical space of Washington Heights, but the social landscape that shaped every interaction, every suspicion, and every moment of conflict. This neighborhood, like many others across America, was a microcosm of broader racial dynamics, where history, fear, and misunderstanding collided with hopes for progress and equality. And it was here in this complex environment that Marcus's story would unfold, demanding attention, empathy, and ultimately change. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting a soft orange glow over Washington Heights. Marcus Bennett was on his usual evening walk, a ritual he cherished after long days spent balancing his transition from military life to civilian responsibilities. The streets, though familiar, held an unpredictable energy, a tension that lingered like an uninvited shadow. Marcus, a man defined by discipline and calm, felt none of this in his stride as he moved steadily down the sidewalk. He wasn't expecting trouble, but trouble found him anyway. Out of nowhere, a firm voice cut through the evening's calm. "Hey, you!" "Stop right there." Sergeant Kyle Rogers stepped forward, his face set with an expression that brooked no argument. Marcus froze his mind, registering the sudden intrusion with the clarity only training can provide. His military instincts kicked in, not a fight, but readiness, assessment, and patience. "Sir, do you have identification?" Kyle demanded, his tone laced with suspicion rather than respect. Marcus glanced at the officer calmly, his voice steady as he replied, "I'm just walking home. May I ask why you're stopping me?" The question hung in the air, a challenge to the assumption behind the order, but Kyle was unmoved. "You match the description of a person we're looking for," he said curtly, pulling out a badge and flashing it briefly, as if that alone justified the sudden interruption. Marcus could see the faint glances from the other officers who had arrived behind Kyle, their numbers growing a visible show of force. It was clear that the situation was escalating beyond a routine inquiry. With measured calm, Marcus responded, "I understand, but I'm not sure what description you mean. I'm happy to cooperate, but I would appreciate understanding why I am being detained." Kyle's eyes narrowed. "We don't need to explain more. Hand over your ID now." Marcus reached into his pocket and retrieved his military ID along with his driver's license. He handed them over slowly, deliberately, maintaining his composure. There was an unspoken tension between the two men, one representing authority wielding power almost reflexively, and the other embodying dignity, refusing to shrink under unwarranted pressure. The officers inspected the documents, but their demeanor didn't soften. "Why are you hanging around here so late?" Kyle asked, voice harder now, as if trying to provoke a reaction. "I live nearby. I was at the gym," Marcus replied quietly, aware that every word was being judged. Kyle's gaze flicked back and forth as if looking for any excuse to justify what was already a forced confrontation. "All right," he said after a pause. "You're free to go, but we'll be watching." Marcus nodded, keeping his calm despite the lingering discomfort. As he resumed walking, the weight of the encounter pressed on him, not physically, but emotionally. The sting of being stopped, questioned, and eyed with suspicion wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a fracture in the foundation of trust between a community and those sworn to protect it. In the days and weeks that followed, Marcus reflected on that night repeatedly. He considered how many others people without his military background, his calm resolve, or his sense of entitlement to respect might respond in similar situations. How often did such encounters spiral into violence, misunderstanding, or worse? His story wasn't just about one officer or one evening. It was about a pattern that stretched far beyond the borders of Washington Heights. The tension that had simmered beneath the surface now boiled into a spotlight, and Marcus Bennett was determined to shine that light. He began reaching out to community leaders, attending town meetings, and sharing his experience in forums dedicated to police accountability. His military discipline and personal resolve gave him a voice that resonated, one that bridged the gap between authority and the everyday citizen caught in the crossfire. The encounter with Sergeant Kyle Rogers was a catalyst, igniting a broader conversation about racial profiling, abuse of power, and the urgent need for reform. But more than that, Marcus's response offered a lesson in courage under pressure, a reminder that dignity and respect are rights owed to all, regardless of the assumptions others make. As this story unfolds, we will witness the ripple effects of that night, the legal battles, the community activism, and the personal growth of a man who refused to be defined by injustice. And through Marcus's journey, we'll explore not only the painful realities of systemic racism, but also the enduring power of resilience and hope. The air was thick with tension as Sergeant Kyle Rogers stepped forward, his stance rigid and imposing. What began as a routine stop was quickly turning into something much darker. Marcus Bennett, a decorated Navy SEAL veteran, stood his ground calmly, but inside the storm was brewing. The flashing lights of patrol cars cast erratic shadows across the street, highlighting the growing crowd gathering to witness the unfolding drama. Kyle's voice, once a measured command, now sharpened into something harsher. "Hand over your ID and don't argue," he barked. Marcus complied immediately, but the officer's tone left no room for respect or reason. The bystanders could sense the shift. This wasn't about safety or procedure anymore. It was about power misused in the open, with no regard for the man before him. Kyle grabbed Marcus's arm roughly, and the veteran winced, his face showing a flicker of shock. This wasn't the welcome home he had imagined after years of service. "I serve this country," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady but filled with pain. "I'm not the enemy here." Kyle sneered, dismissing the words as if they were meaningless. "Don't lecture me," he spat. "You don't get to decide how this goes." The force used was disproportionate, a blunt reminder of the imbalance in their encounter. Marcus felt the sting of humiliation, his uniform, his sacrifices, his very identity ignored as if none of it mattered. A woman from the crowd stepped closer, her phone raised, capturing every moment. "Hey, he's done nothing wrong," she shouted. Kyle's head snapped toward her, his glare freezing the air. "Back off," he warned, his voice sharp and threatening. But the damage was done. The video being recorded would soon travel far beyond the dimly lit street corner, igniting discussions about justice, respect, and systemic failure. Marcus, holding back the urge to react physically, reminded himself of his training to stay composed, to use words, not fists. Yet inside, the hurt was deep, a wound inflicted not by an enemy on the battlefield, but by a man sworn to protect. This moment laid bare the harsh reality many face every day, that sometimes the uniform meant to symbolize protection becomes a tool of oppression. Marcus's story was no longer just his. It became a mirror reflecting the fears, frustrations, and resilience of countless others. The struggle for dignity in the face of unchecked power had begun, and it would not be silenced. As the tension on the street corner thickened, a few onlookers began to quietly pull out their phones. At first it was subtle, a quick tap here, a discreet press of the record button there. But soon the atmosphere changed. The quiet observers became active witnesses, their devices becoming the only shields of truth in a moment otherwise overshadowed by unchecked authority. One by one, phones started capturing the encounter in real time. The shaky but undeniable video showed Sergeant Kyle Rogers pressing Marcus Bennett against the patrol car, demanding identification with an unyielding grip. The camera caught every harsh word, every unjust movement, every moment. Marcus remained composed, despite the rough treatment. Suddenly, a woman in the crowd, a mother named Lisa, turned on her live stream. Her voice was calm but firm, narrating what was unfolding before her eyes. "This man here is a Navy SEAL," she explained softly to her growing audience online. "He's done nothing wrong. This is police harassment, plain and simple." Her live stream surged, viewers multiplying with each passing second, hundreds, then thousands. People from all walks of life across the city and beyond were now watching, bearing witness to an injustice that was no longer confined to a quiet street in Washington Heights. The ripple effect was immediate and powerful. Social media feeds exploded with the video, sparking heated discussions. Hashtags like #StandWithMarcus and #Justice in the streets trended on Twitter. People shared the video alongside stories of their own encounters with systemic bias and abuse. Meanwhile, back on the street, the presence of recording devices made the officers pause for just a moment. The dynamic subtly shifted. Kyle's aggressive stance softened, if only slightly, when he realized the whole scene was no longer just a private confrontation, but a public spectacle, with countless eyes watching. Marcus, despite the situation, felt a flicker of hope. The people's voices and cameras had become an unexpected source of protection. The community was not silent anymore. It was becoming a force to reckon with. A bystander named Jamal, a local community organizer, stepped forward, his voice rising above the crowd. "We see you, Marcus," he said loudly, addressing both the veteran and the officers. "We're watching. This stops now." Jamal's words were met with bows and murmurs of agreement from the gathering crowd. For many, this was not just about Marcus, it was about standing up against a larger pattern of discrimination and abuse. The shared outrage was a call to action, a reminder that power should never silence justice. In this age of smartphones and social media, the balance of power has shifted. The ability of ordinary people to record and broadcast incidents like this has changed the game. No longer could misconduct hide in the shadows. It was exposed to light, raw and undeniable. Marcus's ordeal, once a solitary experience, became a shared story, a beacon for accountability. It highlighted the critical role of citizens as watchdogs, ensuring that those in uniform uphold the very laws they are sworn to protect. The impact of this spontaneous video was profound. It fueled community meetings, inspired calls for policy reviews, and pressured local officials to respond swiftly. No longer could silence be the default response to police misconduct. This chapter in Marcus's story proved a vital lesson that when individuals refuse to look away, when they record, share, and speak out, they become architects of change. The power of the people is not just in their numbers, but in their vigilance and courage to confront injustice head-on. And on that street, under the watchful eyes of a community and the lens of countless cameras, a message was sent loud and clear. No one is invisible. No one's rights can be trampled without consequence. This was more than a moment. It was a movement in its earliest breath, sparked by the simple act of witnessing and recording. The power of the people had awakened. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension as the story of Marcus Bennett continued to unfold, not just the tale of one man's encounter with a police officer, but a reflection of a far larger issue embedded deep within the very systems designed to protect and serve. This was not simply about a single incident, it was about a hidden bias, a systemic problem that permeates policing across the nation. Systemic racism, an invisible yet powerful force, lingers in the shadows of many police departments. It is the thread that connects seemingly isolated acts of injustice into a tapestry of widespread discrimination and abuse of power. The case of Marcus was a stark reminder that despite progress, many institutions still carry the burden of long-standing prejudices. To understand this, we must look beyond the surface. It's not just the explicit, blatant acts of racism, but the subtle, ingrained attitudes that shape decisions, actions, and policies. Sergeant Kyle Rogers, for example, with his history of multiple complaints, yet no serious consequences, wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom of a system that often protects its own shields misconduct and resists accountability. Think about the tragic deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. These names became rallying cries not just because of the individual's suffering, but because their stories exposed the systemic failures of law enforcement agencies. They revealed a culture where racial profiling, excessive use of force, and lack of transparency are alarmingly common. In the same way Marcus Bennett's encounter was not a random misstep, it was rooted in this deep-seated problem. The assumptions made about him, the unjustified suspicion, and the aggressive treatment were all reflective of a pattern, one where Black men, regardless of their service status or character, are disproportionately targeted. The statistics tell a sobering story. Studies have consistently shown that Black Americans are more likely to be stopped, searched, and subjected to force by police. These disparities do not arise from chance, but from systemic factors, biases in training and lack of oversight, in cultures that prioritize loyalty over justice. In many police departments, implicit biases, unconscious attitudes, and stereotypes shape how officers perceive and react to different communities. This means that even without overtly racist intent, decisions can be influenced by ingrained prejudices. These biases, when left unchecked, can escalate encounters unnecessarily, often with tragic results. The problem is compounded by a code of silence within police forces where officers hesitate to report misconduct by their peers. This blue wall of silence ensures that abuses go unpunished, reinforcing a culture where wrongdoing is tolerated or ignored. Yet Marcus Bennett's story also highlights the cracks beginning to form in this system. The presence of witnesses, the viral spread of video evidence, and the public outcry forced authorities to confront the incident. It sparked conversations, demanded investigations, and illuminated what too often remains hidden. Understanding systemic racism in policing is crucial because it moves the conversation beyond individual blame. It compels us to examine the structures, policies, and attitudes that enable injustice. Reform, therefore, must address these root causes, not just remove a few bad actors, but transform the culture and accountability mechanisms within law enforcement. In this context, the experiences of people like Marcus George Floyd and Breonna Taylor are not isolated tragedies, but urgent calls for change. Their stories force us to reckon with uncomfortable truths about how race and power intersect in America's criminal justice system. The path forward requires sustained effort, comprehensive bias training, community oversight, transparent investigations, and a commitment to justice that transcends color lines. Only by acknowledging and dismantling systemic racism can we hope to build a policing system that serves and protects all citizens equally. As the courtroom drama around Marcus Bennett's case unfolded, it became clear that his fight was not just for personal justice, but for a broader reckoning. It was a reminder that behind every badge lies a responsibility to confront bias, uphold integrity, and respect the dignity of every individual. The hidden biases within policing demand our attention, our voices, and our action. Because until they are addressed, stories like Marcus's will continue to be written, and justice will remain elusive for too many. Marcus Bennett's story begins long before the day he encountered Sergeant Kyle Rogers on the streets of Washington Heights. It is a story rooted deeply in discipline, sacrifice, and resilience, woven through years of military service that shaped him both as a soldier and as a man. But beneath the surface of strength lay a vulnerable reality, one that too often remains invisible: the quiet battles against prejudice, even within the very institutions sworn to defend justice and equality. From a young age, Marcus knew that the path he chose wouldn't be easy. At 28, he enlisted in the Navy SEALs, driven by a profound sense of duty and a desire to serve his country. The rigorous training was unlike anything most civilians could imagine. Days and nights blurred together under the pressure of physical endurance, mental toughness, and relentless challenges designed to break the unworthy. Marcus emerged from this crucible tempered, embodying strength and focus. Yet despite the camaraderie and brotherhood expected in military life, Marcus faced invisible barriers. His experiences in the Navy were complicated by the color of his skin and the fact that he was openly gay. These were realities that subjected him to scrutiny, suspicion, and at times outright discrimination. Unlike the battlefield where skill and courage are paramount, the social dynamics within the military carried their own weight. Marcus recalled moments when whispers followed him down the hallways of the barracks, when his capabilities were questioned not because of his performance, but because of who he was. Fellow soldiers, conditioned by society's deep-rooted biases, sometimes failed to see past their own prejudices. And the very system that preached equality sometimes turned a blind eye to these subtle, corrosive forms of exclusion. These experiences forged a complex resilience within Marcus. He learned to compartmentalize, to protect his inner self, while maintaining the outward image of the confident, capable SEAL. His military record was impeccable: decorations for valor, leadership in some of the most challenging operations overseas, and respect earned on merit. Yet the emotional toll of fighting two wars, one abroad, another within, was profound. His vulnerability was rarely visible to others. Marcus was a man of few words when it came to his personal struggles. He bore the scars of microaggressions and overt slights silently. For many veterans like him, the military can be a paradox, a place of honor and discipline, but also of exclusion and pain when identity conflicts with prevailing norms. This layered history became an essential part of the narrative when Marcus faced Sergeant Kyle Rogers. Here was a man who had dedicated his life to protecting others, embodying discipline and courage, yet confronted by a police officer who seemed to disregard all of that. The moment Marcus was stopped, it was not just a simple encounter with law enforcement. It was the collision of two vastly different worlds, one shaped by integrity and sacrifice, the other marred by systemic bias and unchecked authority. Marcus's military past gave him a unique perspective and strength to face the injustice, but it also highlighted the harsh reality that even a decorated veteran could be reduced to suspicion and mistreatment. It forced many to question, how could a man who had risked everything for his country be treated as a threat in his own neighborhood? This contradiction struck a chord with many who followed Marcus's story. It exposed the uncomfortable truth that valor and service do not provide immunity from prejudice. It revealed the limitations of progress and underscored how systemic issues within law enforcement and society at large continue to erode the dignity of those who deserve respect most. The narrative of Marcus Bennett's military journey is not just about his personal history. It serves as a mirror reflecting the broader struggle of countless individuals who serve with honor but face discrimination at home. His story is a call to acknowledge and confront the biases that persist within even our most revered institutions. In sharing this part of Marcus's life, the story invites listeners to feel both admiration for his courage and empathy for the challenges he endured. It bridges the gap between strength and vulnerability, revealing a man who, despite his formidable exterior, experienced the same pains of exclusion and misunderstanding that so many face. Through Marcus's experience, we come to see the human cost of systemic racism, not just in the moments of conflict, but in the lifelong shadows it casts. This understanding compels us to demand change not only in policing, but in every corner of society where inequality hides. Marcus's past shapes his present fight, a fight not only for justice for himself, but for all those whose voices have been silenced by prejudice. His journey through the military and beyond embodies the complex reality of American society, a nation built on ideals of freedom and equality, yet still wrestling with the legacy of discrimination. As we delve deeper into Marcus's story, we are reminded that true courage is not just about bravery on the battlefield. It is also found in the resilience to stand up against injustice, to assert one's dignity in the face of systemic oppression, and to demand a future where every individual is seen and valued beyond the color of their skin or their personal identity. This part of the story sets the stage for the challenges that Marcus would face on that fateful day and the strength he would draw from a lifetime of overcoming adversity. It's a testament to the complexity of identity service and the ongoing struggle for justice in America. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the familiar streets of Washington Heights. Marcus Bennett, tall and composed, was making his usual walk home. His mind was occupied with thoughts of family plans for the weekend and the quiet satisfaction of a mission accomplished. He had just finished a meeting with a local veterans group, a community he deeply cared about. His posture was calm, but beneath the surface, a storm was about to break. Suddenly, a sharp voice cut through the calm afternoon. "Hey, you!" "Stop right there," Marcus froze. From around the corner, Sergeant Kyle Rogers appeared with a squad of officers. The abruptness of the command startled not only Marcus, but also passers-by, who turned to watch. The police presence felt disproportionate, overwhelming a group ready to assert dominance rather than to seek understanding. Kyle Rogers stepped forward, his gaze hard and unyielding. He was a man with a reputation, a history marked by complaints of excessive force and racial bias, yet he remained shielded by the very system meant to hold officers accountable. Today he carried that badge with a certainty that brooked no dissent. "Sir, I need to see some identification," Kyle demanded, his tone sharp and accusatory. Marcus calmly reached into his pocket and produced his military ID, the seal of the Navy SEALs proudly displayed. "Here it is," he said evenly, his voice steady but firm. Kyle barely glanced at the card. "This doesn't give you the right to ignore me. You're acting suspiciously," he retorted. Marcus's eyes met Kyle's, unwavering. "I'm walking home. I haven't done anything wrong. Am I free to go?" The words hung in the air, loaded with tension. Around them, the few bystanders held their breath. Marcus's voice was clear, controlled, but beneath the surface simmered frustration and disbelief. Here he was, a man who had served his country with honor, being challenged without cause. Kyle's response was immediate and harsh. "Don't get smart with me. You're going to stay right here until I say otherwise." Marcus took a deep breath, summoning the discipline honed over years in the military. His training was not just physical, it was mental resilience, the ability to stay calm under pressure. He refused to escalate the situation, knowing that his composure was his strongest weapon. "I'm not trying to be difficult," Marcus said, his tone respectful but firm. "I understand you have a job to do, but I also know my rights. If there's no reason to detain me, I'd appreciate being allowed to continue on my way." Kyle's eyes narrowed. "You don't get to lecture me about rights. Just cooperate." As Kyle's voice rose, the surrounding atmosphere thickened. The presence of other officers added weight to the moment. Marcus's hands remained visible, his posture relaxed but alert. He was aware of the cameras from bystanders, the whispers of growing spectators. "Sergeant Rogers," Marcus said, lifting his voice so it could be heard clearly, "I served this country in the Navy SEALs. I fought for the freedoms we all enjoy. I'm not a threat, and I deserve to be treated with respect. I'm asking you to respect my dignity." The crowd murmured. Some nodded in agreement, Others exchanged worried glances. The power dynamics were clear: a man sworn to protect and serve using authority to intimidate, and a veteran standing tall against injustice with quiet dignity. Kyle's response was a mixture of impatience and thinly veiled disdain. "I don't care who you are. You're acting like you're above the law." Marcus shook his head slightly, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders, but not breaking his spirit. "No one is above the law. That includes everyone, police officers and citizens alike. But the law also protects us from abuse. And today I am here to remind you of that." At that moment, the tension in the air was palpable. The officers watching held their breath. The bystanders recorded on their phones, ready to share every word and gesture. Marcus's resolve did not waver. His voice, steady and clear, carried a message beyond the immediate confrontation. It was a call for fairness, for accountability, and for recognition of shared humanity. Kyle, confronted by a man who refused to submit, was forced to choose. Would he escalate or would he relent? For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then Kyle barked an order, his tone sharp. "Put your hands behind your back." Marcus complied without resistance. His training as a SEAL meant he understood discipline and control, but he also knew this was an abuse of power. He was being detained without cause, his rights ignored. Yet even as the handcuffs clicked shut, Marcus maintained his composure. He spoke calmly, loudly enough for the crowd and officers alike to hear. "This isn't about me. It's about justice and the respect every person deserves, no matter their color, rank, or background." The clash between authority and dignity was laid bare in that moment. Marcus, a decorated veteran, became a symbol of resistance against systemic injustice, standing firm when power was wielded unjustly. As he was led away, the crowd's reactions swelled from shock to outrage. The video captured by witnesses began to circulate, sparking conversations nationwide about race privilege and the misuse of authority. Marcus's stance, firm, respectful, unwavering, became a beacon for those demanding change. His story illustrated that standing up against injustice, even in the face of overwhelming force, was not just courageous, it was necessary. This confrontation was more than a single incident. It was a microcosm of a broader struggle, a testament to the strength of those who refuse to be silenced and the urgent need for accountability in policing. Through Marcus's eyes, listeners can feel the weight of this moment, the fear, the resolve, and ultimately the unyielding fight for dignity in the face of adversity. The handcuffs clicked shut, cold and unyielding, against Marcus Bennett's wrists. The officer's grip tightened, and as they led him away from the sidewalk where his calm stand had just taken place, an electric wave of shock and disbelief rippled through the gathered crowd. Whispers swelled into murmurs, murmurs into heated discussions, and heated discussions into cries for justice. This was no ordinary arrest. It was a blatant display of power, misused of authority, wielded against a man who had sacrificed so much for his country. Onlookers pulled out their phones, their cameras capturing every moment. The videos uploaded within minutes, quickly spreading across social media platforms. Hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #AccountTheBadge began trending as people around the city and soon the nation expressed outrage. The image of a decorated Navy SEAL being subdued by a cop with a history of complaints struck a nerve. It resonated deeply, stirring memories of countless other instances where those sworn to protect instead perpetuated harm. Back at home, Marcus's wife Lena sat frozen, her heart pounding. The phone buzzed relentlessly with messages from friends, neighbors, and concerned strangers who had seen the video. Their disbelief and anger mirrored hers, but so did a spark of hope that this time the story might be different. This time they might be heard. Lena's voice trembled as she recounted the moment she first learned of the incident. "I couldn't believe it. Marcus, my strong, calm husband, someone who has faced real danger for this country, being treated like a criminal on our own streets. It broke something inside me. But amidst the pain, there was determination. We can't stay silent, not anymore." Meanwhile, the local community gathered, rallying around Marcus's family. In coffee shops, community centers, and places of worship, conversations turned to action. Plans for peaceful protest took shape. Legal aid organizations stepped forward to offer support. The narrative shifted from individual injustice to systemic failure. Journalists descended upon the neighborhood eager to hear from witnesses and experts. Reporters interviewed those who had filmed the incident, giving voice to those who had watched power collide with vulnerability in real time. These first-hand accounts revealed a pattern, a history of tension, mistrust, and unaddressed grievances that had simmered beneath the surface for years. The media spotlight intensified scrutiny on Sergeant Kyle Rogers, whose disciplinary record revealed a disturbing trend. 6 complaints, none leading to serious consequences, spoke volumes about institutional reluctance to hold officers accountable. Experts weighed in, dissecting how a culture of silence and protectionism within police departments allowed problematic officers to continue unchecked. Social media became a battleground. Supporters of Marcus flooded timelines with calls for reform, sharing stories of similar incidents nationwide. Opponents argued over law enforcement's challenges, but the dominant sentiment was clear. The public demanded change. Online petitions gathered thousands of signatures demanding transparency and justice. As pressure mounted, city officials were forced to respond. Public statements promised investigations and reviews, but skepticism lingered. Community leaders insisted that words must be backed by action, pushing for independent oversight and systemic reform. The incident had ignited a flame of activism, one that refused to be extinguished by platitudes or delays. In the midst of this turmoil, Marcus's personal resolve remained unshaken. From a hospital bed where officers had reluctantly allowed him to be treated for minor injuries sustained during his detention, Marcus spoke out. "This isn't just about me. It's about every person who's ever been judged, harassed, or hurt because of their skin color. It's about reclaiming our dignity and demanding accountability from those sworn to serve us all." His words resonated deeply, inspiring others to come forward with their stories. Support groups formed, bringing together veterans, activists, and ordinary citizens united by a common cause. Marcus became a symbol, a living testament to resilience and the urgent need for justice. Yet beneath the surface of this growing movement, there were challenges. Fear lingered among some witnesses, hesitant to speak out against law enforcement. The path to change was fraught with obstacles, including entrenched biases and institutional inertia. But the collective voice of the community grew stronger with each passing day, fueled by the undeniable power of recorded truth. This incident was more than a moment of injustice. It was a catalyst. It exposed fractures within the system, illuminated the human cost of prejudice, and ignited a renewed commitment to fight for equality. The fallout was raw and painful, but it carried with it the promise of transformation, a hope that through vigilance and courage, a more just society could emerge. As the nation watched, the story of Marcus Bennett reminded us all of the fragile balance between authority and humanity. It challenged us to confront uncomfortable truths and to stand firmly against injustice wherever it hides. The immediate reactions, charged with emotion, outrage, and hope, marked the beginning of a journey. A journey that demanded not only accountability for one man's mistreatment, but a reckoning with the deep-rooted issues that allow such mistreatment to persist. In these reactions, we find the seeds of change, the voices of a community refusing to accept anything less than justice, and the unwavering spirit of a man who, despite it all, stood tall. The buzz in the police department was palpable as the Internal Affairs Unit, commonly known as the Thin Blue Line, began their investigation into the incident involving Sergeant Kyle Rogers and Marcus Bennett. This unit, tasked with policing the police, holds a complicated position within the law enforcement ecosystem. Charged with ensuring accountability, yet often shackled by institutional loyalty and pressure, the Internal Affairs Division navigates a precarious balance between transparency and protectionism. When the complaint against Sergeant Rogers landed on their desks, investigators knew they were stepping into a delicate situation. The public's eye was sharp, the media relentless, and the community's patience thin. Yet within the walls of the department, whispers of "we've seen this before" and "don't rock the boat" echoed in the hallways. The history of similar cases loomed, large cases where officers accused of misconduct were shielded, investigations stalled, and outcomes often favored those wearing the badge. Inside the investigation room, Detective Rachel Martinez sat across from a pile of files detailing Sergeant Rogers' record. 6 complaints of excessive force and racially insensitive behavior over the past 7 years, none leading to substantial disciplinary action. Each case had been quietly closed with vague findings and minimal consequences. It was a pattern, one that raised red flags, yet was disturbingly common. Rachel sighed, rubbing her temples. This isn't just about one officer, she muttered to her partner, Detective James Turner. It's about a culture that protects its own at the expense of justice. She understood the weight of the task ahead. Public trust was eroding fast, and the department's reputation was on the line. But breaking through the walls of silence and solidarity within the force was no easy feat. Throughout the investigation, Rachel and James encountered subtle resistance. Officers were reluctant to testify against a colleague. Some declined interviews, others forgot details, and a few outright stonewalled the inquiry. This defensive stance was a manifestation of the infamous blue wall of silence, an unwritten code that discourages police from reporting on misconduct by fellow officers. Rachel pressed on, knowing that her role was crucial. She interviewed witnesses, reviewed body cam footage, and cross-referenced reports. Yet she was painfully aware that institutional pressures could influence the investigation's direction. The department's leadership faced a dilemma: uphold justice or preserve unity. The fear of internal backlash, lawsuits, and public outrage hung over every decision. Outside the precinct, community members watched with cautious optimism. Activists and local leaders demanded transparency and swift action. "We want truth, not cover-ups," declared Jasmine Carter, a prominent civil rights advocate. Her voice, echoed by many others, pushed city officials to apply pressure on the police department to handle the case with integrity. The tension was tangible during city council meetings, where heated debates unfolded over police accountability. Residents shared stories of past abuses, expressing frustration that nothing had changed. "How many more Marcus Bennett's have to suffer before the system works for us?" one woman asked tearfully. The call for independent oversight boards grew louder. Inside the department, Rachel and James faced the reality that the internal affairs unit alone could not fix a system fraught with systemic bias and entrenched loyalties. Their work was a first step, but lasting change required structural reform and cultural shifts. They drafted detailed reports highlighting procedural lapses, failures in supervision, and missed opportunities to intervene with Sergeant Rogers before the incident escalated. Yet even as these reports circulated, the department was divided. Some officers saw the investigation as a betrayal, fueling resentment. Others quietly supported the push for reform, but feared the personal and professional costs of speaking out. Rachel found herself navigating a labyrinth of politics, ethics, and personal convictions, all while under intense public scrutiny. Throughout the process, the media kept the story alive. Headlines questioned the efficacy of internal investigations nationwide, exposing patterns of leniency that undermined public confidence. National organizations weighed in, citing statistics showing that only a fraction of police misconduct complaints lead to disciplinary action, highlighting a systemic problem far beyond one city. As days turned into weeks, the internal affairs investigation culminated in recommendations for disciplinary measures against Sergeant Rogers. However, questions remained. Would the department enforce these recommendations fully? Would the leadership commit to rooting out deeper cultural issues? Or would this be another case quietly swept under the rug? For Marcus Bennett and the community, the investigation symbolized both hope and skepticism. It was a chance for accountability, but also a reminder of how difficult it was to dismantle protective barriers within law enforcement. The thin blue line, while essential for police solidarity, could also become a shield for wrongdoing. This chapter in the story revealed a critical lesson. True justice requires vigilance, not only from outside observers, but from those within the system willing to challenge the status quo. The investigation by Internal Affairs was not the end, but a crucial moment of reckoning, a test of whether the ideals of justice could overcome the inertia of institutional protection. As the narrative unfolded, it became clear that the battle for fairness in policing was as much about changing minds and hearts as it was about changing policies and procedures. The thin line between loyalty and accountability had been stretched to its limits, and the community watched closely, demanding transparency, fairness, and respect for the rights of all citizens. This internal affairs investigation would either mark a turning point toward reform or a missed opportunity in a long history of systemic failures. For Marcus, the stakes were personal, but for the city and nation, they represented a crossroads in the ongoing struggle for equality and justice under the law. Inside the ranks of the police department, there existed a quiet, often overlooked, but powerful force officers who refused to accept the status quo of racism and abuse within their own ranks. These were the voices within courageous individuals who, despite immense pressure and potential backlash, chose to stand up against the deeply rooted prejudices that had long tainted the badge they wore. Among them was Officer Michael Evans, a 42-year-old African-American veteran of the force with over 15 years of service. Michael had seen it all: the camaraderie, the danger, the loyalty, but also the subtle and overt acts of discrimination against minority communities and fellow officers. He knew firsthand how the blue wall could silence even the most well-intentioned voices. One afternoon, during a rare moment of quiet in the precinct break room, Michael confided in his colleague Sarah Thompson, a white officer and one of the few allies who openly challenged the racist undertones in their department. "I've had enough," Sarah, Michael said, his voice heavy with frustration, but laced with resolve. "This isn't just about Marcus Bennett's case. It's about every black man, every minority who's been stopped, searched, or worse, without cause. We're supposed to protect and serve everyone. But sometimes I wonder if we're protecting just ourselves." Sarah nodded solemnly. "I feel it too. There's a culture here that's resistant to change, but we have to push back even if it means risking our careers. We owe it to the community and to ourselves." Their conversations weren't isolated. Across the department, a small but growing group of officers diverse in race, gender, and background began meeting informally to discuss ways to challenge discriminatory practices and support victims like Marcus. They shared stories of instances where officers had been pressured to look the other way, or worse, participate in acts that betrayed the public trust. Officer Jamal Harris, a young black patrolman, recounted his experience during a roll call meeting. The captain made a joke about those people. Again, Jamal recalled, shaking his head. "I wanted to speak up, but the room was silent. If I said something, I'd be seen as a troublemaker. But I realized silence is complicity." This realization fueled their commitment to act. The group, informally dubbed Blue for Justice, began documenting cases of racial bias, encouraging fellow officers to report misconduct anonymously, and even reaching out to community leaders to foster dialogue. Their courage came with costs. Michael described the social isolation he faced after voicing concerns. "Some officers stopped talking to me. Invitations disappeared. You feel the pressure to conform or get out. It's a lonely fight." Sarah faced her own challenges. "Being a white officer standing against racism in the force isn't always welcomed. I get labeled as naive or soft on crime. But I know true justice requires confronting uncomfortable truths." Despite the obstacles, these officers believed their actions were vital to the department's healing. They saw themselves as agents of change from within, bridging the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. Their efforts caught the attention of higher-ups sympathetic to reform, who cautiously began supporting internal training focused on implicit bias, de-escalation tactics, and cultural competency. However, progress was slow and met with resistance from factions entrenched in old-school policing mentalities. In community meetings, officers like Michael and Sarah became bridges, sharing their experiences to rebuild trust. They emphasized that not all officers condone discrimination, highlighting the complexity within the force. One poignant moment came when Michael spoke at a neighborhood forum. "I am proud to wear this badge," he said, "but I am equally ashamed when it's used as a shield for injustice. We must hold ourselves accountable. Change begins with us." These voices within were essential not only for exposing misconduct, but for nurturing a culture of accountability. They challenged their peers to reflect on biases and the consequences of unchecked power. Their stories also underscored a crucial lesson: systemic racism in policing cannot be dismantled solely through external pressure. It requires internal champions willing to face hostility and isolation to foster transformation. In the larger narrative of Marcus Bennett's case, these officers represented hope. Their presence signaled that amidst pain and injustice, there were those committed to a more equitable future, officers who refused to let racism define their service or tarnish their profession. Their resilience provided a blueprint for other departments grappling with similar issues. By sharing their stories, they encouraged transparency and the dismantling of harmful traditions that had long plagued law enforcement. In a society demanding justice and equality, the courage of officers like Michael Cera and Jamal Mal reminded everyone that change is possible when individuals step beyond fear to uphold the true values of policing: fairness, respect, and protection for all. Their journey was neither easy nor guaranteed to succeed, but it marked a critical step toward healing fractured relationships and redefining what it means to wear the badge with honor and integrity. As the dust settled from that tense encounter on the street, Marcus Bennett knew that the battle was far from over. What had begun as a moment of unjustified harassment by Officer Kyle Rogers would soon escalate into a long, arduous legal struggle, one that would test not only Marcus's resilience, but the very fabric of justice in their community. From the very start, Marcus understood the gravity of what lay ahead. He was no stranger to fighting tough battles. After all his years as a Navy SEAL had forged his strength, endurance, and unyielding commitment to justice. But this fight was different. It wasn't on a battlefield overseas. This was a battle within the courts and institutions of the very country he had sworn to protect. Marcus's first step was to assemble a legal team that understood both the complexities of civil rights law and the social realities of systemic racism. His lead attorney, Elizabeth Carmichael, was a seasoned civil rights lawyer known for taking on police misconduct cases and winning against the odds. In their first meeting, Elizabeth laid out the formidable challenges ahead. "Marcus," she said, her voice steady yet compassionate, "you're facing a system designed to protect itself first. Police departments have layers of legal protections, qualified immunity, and unions that shield officers from accountability. It won't be easy, but your story is powerful, your service, your character, and this clear case of abuse. We'll fight this, but we have to be prepared for resistance." Marcus nodded. "I'm ready. This is about more than me. It's about every person who's been wronged and silenced." The initial filing sparked an immediate reaction from the police union and city officials. Legal defenses were mounted swiftly, focusing on justifying the officer's actions, claiming reasonable suspicion, and alleging that Marcus was non-compliant. Behind the scenes, Marcus's team encountered a common obstacle: access to evidence. Dashcam footage was reportedly lost, and internal reports were heavily redacted. It was clear that some within the department were intent on burying the truth. Meanwhile, media scrutiny intensified. News outlets began to cover the story extensively, drawing parallels to other well-known cases of police abuse. Public pressure mounted as activists and community leaders demanded transparency and justice. Marcus, despite his military background, found himself navigating a different kind of battlefield, one where public opinion, political maneuvering, and legal technicalities intertwined. Late nights blurred into early mornings as Marcus and Elizabeth pored over documents, drafted motions, and prepared for depositions. Each day brought fresh obstacles: legal loopholes exploited by defense lawyers, bureaucratic delays, and sometimes subtle intimidation. Elizabeth explained the strategy during one particularly tense phone call. "We have to build an airtight case," she said. "Witness testimonies, expert reports on police procedures, psychological evaluations of the officer involved, everything matters. And we need to humanize you to the jury. They need to see you not as a statistic, but as a person." Marcus reflected on the emotional toll. "It's hard. Sometimes I feel the weight of it all, the constant reminders of that night, the fear that justice won't come. But I know giving up isn't an option." Through it all, Marcus's family stood as his pillar of strength. His wife, Lisa, juggled supporting him emotionally while caring for their two young children. She became a vocal advocate herself, speaking at rallies and community forums, emphasizing that Marcus's fight was their fight, a fight for dignity and fairness for all. The legal battles dragged on for months. Courtroom hearings unveiled a complex tapestry of testimonies, some corroborating Marcus's account, others defending the officers. Police experts debated the protocols, while psychologists testified about the trauma inflicted on Marcus. The public followed each development with bated breath. However, the case also exposed the systemic barriers victims often face. The city council hesitated to take decisive action, wary of alienating law enforcement or igniting further unrest. Meanwhile, some officers within the department rallied in defense of Kyle Rogers, complicating efforts to foster internal reform. Amidst this turbulent backdrop, Marcus's legal team secured a breakthrough when a whistleblower from inside the police department anonymously provided unredacted documents. These revealed previous complaints against Rogers that had been systematically ignored or minimized. The revelations that electrified the case and shifted momentum toward accountability. The courtroom atmosphere grew more charged. Defense attorneys attempted to discredit witnesses and paint Marcus as confrontational, but Elizabeth skillfully countered, emphasizing the broader context of racial bias and the abuse of authority. Marcus himself testified, speaking with measured calm but undeniable conviction. "I have served my country with honor," he said, eyes steady. "That night I was not a threat. I was a citizen exercising my rights. This case is not just about me. It's about ensuring that no one else suffers like this." His words resonated beyond the courtroom, sparking renewed calls for police reform and justice. Throughout this journey, Marcus grappled with the personal cost. The stress impacted his health and mental well-being. Elizabeth reminded him often that this was a marathon, not a sprint, and that the fight for justice, though grueling, was vital. The community's support never waned. Local organizations provided resources, counseling, and platforms for dialogue. Their solidarity amplified Marcus's voice, reminding everyone that change requires collective effort. As the legal battle unfolded, it became clear that this was not just a case against one officer, but a challenge to entrenched systems resistant to scrutiny. It highlighted the urgent need for transparency, accountability, and cultural shifts within law enforcement. Marcus's fight inspired others, victims, advocates, even some within the police force who sought reform to come forward and demand change. It illustrated the power of persistence, courage, and truth in confronting injustice. This chapter in Marcus Bennett's story was a testament to resilience. It showed how one man's stand could ignite a movement, revealing cracks in the system and pushing society toward reflection and reform. Though the path was fraught with obstacles, Marcus remained steadfast, buoyed by the belief that justice, while often delayed, must never be denied. The night the video went viral, the streets of Washington Heights erupted in a wave of quiet but powerful protest. It wasn't chaos or violence. Instead, it was a sea of people standing shoulder to shoulder, unified in a shared purpose to demand justice for Marcus Bennett, the Navy SEAL, who had been stopped, questioned, and harassed, not because of anything he did, but because of the color of his skin. In the days that followed, neighborhood parks and city squares filled with voices calling for change. Local activists, civil rights groups, and community leaders organized peaceful marches and rallies. Signs read, "Justice for Marcus N., police racism, and protect our rights." The movement wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It had become a symbol of a larger fight against systemic racial bias in law enforcement. At the forefront was Jasmine Lopez, a prominent community organizer who had spent years fighting for police accountability. She spoke passionately at a rally, her voice carrying over the crowd. Marcus's story is a reminder that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are here not just to support one man, but to stand against a system that repeatedly fails our communities of color. The protests were diverse, attracting people from all walks of life: students, veterans, parents, even some police officers who believed in reform. The energy was palpable but grounded in respect and determination. Jasmine and her team ensured that the demonstration stayed peaceful, organizing workshops on civil rights and community policing, inviting speakers to educate and inspire. As the movement grew, social media amplified its reach exponentially. Hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and "Change the Badge" trended nationwide. Videos from the protests circulated widely, bringing unprecedented attention to the issue. Traditional media outlets, once hesitant, began covering the story in depth.